starting to feel like I should be paying rent here. Degas is a painter who, or an artist I should say, who took me a long time to get to. Now, part of that, I think, is that he is an extraordinarily difficult and uningratiating and prickly kind of artist. And part of it, I think, must go back to the fact that when I was a lot younger and I was dancing very seriously, people kept thinking that the person who painted all those ballet dancers ought to be my favorite artist. And it almost put me off for life. I suppose most grateful to Meyer Shapiro for having brought me back to my senses and to making me see how extraordinary Degas really was. But I think in my own experience is one of the, shall we say, problems of Degas. He's one of those extraordinarily well-known and misconceived artists. He has been described, I think, quite accurately as the most misunderstood of famous modern artists. Because the name is instantly recognizable, even allowing for the enormous popularity of Impressionism. He's a particularly popular Impressionist. He's one of the few artists who I think has entered the public consciousness in the way perhaps that only Van Gogh and Picasso have, but where certainly every nuance of Van Gogh's biography and every nuance of Picasso's vagaries with women are well known. Very, very little can be told to you by most people about Degas. He is that painter of ballet dancers. Well, the more you look at his work, the more you realize that that is just not true. Could I have the first two slides, please? He is certainly far more than that painter of ballet dancers. An early self-portrait included because it's such a ravishing thing, and I thought it would be a nice thing to look at by way of introduction. And another relatively early double portrait, Degas and one of his numerous relations. A painter who, at first glance, would seem to be easily categorized as an impressionist from works like these, with their, particularly the one on the right with its luminous, elusive background, and the smudge, delicate incisions in the work on the left. But I'd like you to just, shall we say, hold off on characterizing him that way for a bit. The more you look at the double portrait on the right, I think the less impressionist it becomes. It's not about visual phenomena. It's about two very introspective people linked in a curious way by their poses, by their physical resemblance, and yet quite isolated from one another. And it has a firmness of contour and an emphasis on clear silhouette that seems very particular. There's a sense of psychological penetration, of introspection, that seems to have nothing to do with visual phenomena. And it turns out that this man, who was supposedly the painter of ballet dancers, painted all kinds of other things as well. Surprisingly enough, some of the most intimate and unguarded images of women in modern art. Surprising because one of the things that is generally cited about Degas is that he was a total misogynist. He never married. He had few friends of either sex, went out little, generally was curmudgeonly. At least that's the general report. If you dig a little deeper, you find there are rather affectionate memoirs that make him sound a lot more interesting than that. Boileau, who presents a warmer and certainly loyaler person to his friends. And then there are records of his biting wit. He was quoted around Paris. But it's true that he was he was quite self-contained, and few people were allowed in the studio. The only woman that he's known to have been particularly friendly with among the artists was Mary Cassatt, and that, of course, is why the Havemeyer collection has such extraordinary Degas, because Mary Cassatt was advising the Havemeyers. That's also why the Havemeyer collection has figurative Caros rather than landscapes, because Degas didn't like Caro's landscapes as much as his figures, and that was passed on to the Havemeyers. So Degas is very much with us through this connection. These images of women, unguarded, going about their ordinary lives, are certainly not what you would expect from someone who is described as a misogynist. There's also, formally in these pictures, these are relatively late, these are pastels, with this rough, worked, loaded surface that doesn't come through in slides at all, that you all know from seeing the works. There's a kind of firm, clear, almost classical underpinning to these images that again seems very much at odds with what we usually associate with Impressionism. You could argue that that firmness of structure is something that perhaps is indebted to Japanese prints, which of course Degas, like many of his generation, found extraordinarily provocative and interesting for their clarity, their intensity of color, for their structure that owed nothing to the classical past. A remarkable picture like the one on the right, of course, is deeply indebted to the Japanese prints that were known at the time, in the collapsing of space and in these floating, extraordinary silhouettes. But the same man who made that image also made this extraordinary landscape monotype on the left. Something that seems so almost accidental, almost unwilled. So much about discovery and so much about its own making that I could probably have told you that was a Helen Frankenthaler and you'd believe me. She wouldn't mind either, I suspect. Well, what am I driving at? I mean, here is someone that is impossible to pin down. I mean, he's a kind of closet landscape painter. Most of his friends didn't know that he painted landscapes. He only did so when he was driven out of the studio when he traveled. This monotype technique was something he virtually invented, a reworking of monotypes. But it was such an important part of his work to him that the only one-man show that he ever had in his life, the only solo show that he had in his life, he chose to show landscapes. Here is someone who doesn't fit into any of the categories. The more we know about him, the more his work seems unstable, elusive, complicated, and the harder it is to make him fit into the category that we thought he belonged to. This, again, I keep using the word extraordinary, these startling, potent images, the double portrait of his sister and her husband, the Duc de Maubeuge, and one of the pastels of dancers. Finally, an image of ballet dancers. They are both totally disparate and totally predictable in a sense if you know what Degas' formation was and who the artists were that he admired. We know that he was passionate about Ingres and collected hundreds of Ingres drawings and a few paintings. He was equally passionate about Delacroix and collected drawings and paintings. But the largest number of works in his collection were works by Daumier. something like 6 paintings and drawings and something like 1,800 prints. Well, what do you make of that? I mean, here's someone who's responding to the color and the looseness and the emotion, the romanticism of Delacroix. He's responding to the discipline, the clarity, the channeling of emotion, the neoclassicism, to give it a label, of Ingres, even though we know that Ingres' neoclassicism is superheated and there are all those harem scenes, you know. And he's responding to this kind of vernacular casual realism, the extraordinary way of characterizing figures by their stances through drawing that was so admired in Daumier by people as diverse as Degas and Henry James. You know that Henry James wrote a wonderful piece about Daumier. All of this means that he is by no means what we would call an orthodox impressionist. If you define impressionism in the textbook way of, you know, divided color, broken stroke, out of plein air, painting from the motif, out of doors. Of course, if you only define impressionism that way, you're going to end up with only Monet allowed to be an impressionism. It's as though if you define abstract expressionism in a textbook way, you're going to find the only one who fits in is de Kooning. So this is also telling us that impressionism is a far more diverse enterprise than popularly thought. But it means that this is a man who is first and foremost an independent thinker. Yes, he was associated with the Impressionists. He was one of the founders of the Society of Painters, Sculptors, and Engravers, whose mission was to organize unjuried independent shows. The first one being the 1874 show in Nadar's studio that gave Impressionism its name. He later regretted being associated with the group. He didn't like being labeled. And all of these diverse and conflicting and perhaps mutually exclusive influences go into making these very curious, personal, and I would say powerful images. Even the images of ballet dancers turn out not to be what we think, because they're not images of beauty and grace and lightness and effortlessness. They're images of hard work. This dancer stretching her back, not in a moment of performance, but in a moment of the chaos behind the scenes, is typical, just as the scenes of women going about their daily life, working, going to the shops, or bathing, doing ordinary things. And those are his main subject matter. And that, perhaps, is where we can call Degas an impressionist, because he's using subjects of the everyday world, of his own day, as Zola exhorted his friends to make it modern. And he's choosing moments that are transitional moments. He's also a realist, the way the rest of his generation were. I think that's the great lesson of that wonderful exhibition we just saw, Origins of Impressionism. That the thirst of this generation, of the new painters, was not for novelty, but for the real. And of course, Courbet becomes the great model for them, both as someone who managed to make a career without going through the usual system, thumbing his nose at the Academy, organizing his own exhibitions, generally carrying on and being obstreperous, and winning a great deal of attention. Not only because he was obstreperous, but the paintings are good. I think you could describe Courbet's realism as a realism of experience, painting things that were true to what he himself had corporeally known, of physical sensation. The generation of Degas substitutes for this an optical realism, a realism of what is seen. But there's still a desire to be truthful. And the most extreme example of that in Degas is this kind of anomalous object, the only sculpture that he ever exhibited in his lifetime, Little Dancer, 14 years old. A study for it on the left, which gives you a sense of how this thing was developed. A figure made faithfully to the body and then dressed up, literally, with a real skirt. You know, you've all seen it, a real hair ribbon. The original plaster had a horsehair wig. And when it was exhibited, not in the bronze, it wasn't cast until later, it created a furor. It was a kind of monster of realism. In a different way than Rodin's Age of Bronze was seen as a monster of realism. That he was accused of having cast from the body and not having sculpted it at all. This being smaller than life size, everybody knew that it was made, but they were horrified by it. And startled, and it's still startling. There's something extraordinarily disturbing about this tense bronze figure wearing this real skirt and this real hair ribbon. What bothered the critics of 1889 was the fact that she appeared to be, as they said, they complained about her expression, vicieux, riddled with vice. Not a nice girl. And of course, ballet dancers were available women at that time. The feminists, of course, have made much of this. The issue here is that it's both one of the few times that Degas reveals his hand, because he was otherwise a closet sculptor as well as a closet landscape painter. He devoted an enormous amount of time to making sculpture, but it was never shown in his lifetime, except for this one bizarre, atypical piece. And it won him more of a reputation as a kind of notorious modernist than as a serious sculptor. It was seen as a piece that was deliberately shocking. The people who frequented his studio, or who got into his studio at all, commented often on seeing masses of sculpture in various stages of decay. Evidence that he'd been working on this. And evidence that it was something that he took very, very seriously, that it was not simply something that he did as a sideline. He spoke sometimes of having the work cast, which suggests that he wanted it to be permanent. On the other hand, he never did cast anything. Hohlt tells the story of going to the studio to see a work that was ready to be cast and finding nothing but a lump of clay. The dancer that had been described to him had been crushed down again. And there's this famous quote from Degas where he says, well, Hohlt, all you're thinking about is what you could have sold it for. But I wouldn't take a basket of gold for the pleasure I had in collapsing it and starting over again. Degas was by no means a technically adept sculptor. In fact, I think he cultivated a kind of ignorance, just as Matisse did, and it was extraordinarily liberating. Technically, I'm told these things were disastrous. He mixed clay and wax together. The armatures would start bending under the weight of the material. He didn't care. If he needed to eke out a shape, he would add cork, he would add paper. And it all had to do with how it felt under the hand. It had nothing to do with traditional techniques of sculpture where weight has to be transferred in a logical way and the thing has to balance and it accords, certainly in the 19th century, academic ideals. As with Matisse, it allowed him to invent new kinds of sculpture, such as this other remarkable object, a tub, that when it was first made was even more bizarre because it exploited colors of white plaster and red wax. It's bizarre enough to have a sculpture that includes water. I don't know of any other that actually has an image of water in it. So that when you see the sculpture from the side, I was looking for a head-on slide, and unfortunately I couldn't find one, rather than looking down on it, where it's strange enough, but you realize that the limbs are very contorted, folded into one another, and then sliced by the level of the water and the level of the tub. So you have this object which consists of layers, horizontal layers, and then this kind of trapped, emerging body from it. There's really nothing like it before or since until you get to people like Anthony Caro, who can express this in an abstract way. Not a sculpture that Degas followed up on formally, intellectually he certainly did. So there is, on the one hand, this scrupulous naturalism, this ferocious realism, and this extraordinary invention and exploration. For me, I think the most modern thing about Degas is not formal. It has nothing to do with, well, I should backtrack. It has little to do with how. It has an awful lot to do with what. Important as the how is in Degas. It has to do with a sense of immanence, of incompleteness, of showing things not at the crowning moment, or even the most telling moment, but of something in between, a moment of transition that apparently is picked almost at random. So that the images of the dancers, as I've said, are the images of class, of rehearsal, and of a kind of controlled chaos that any of you who've ever been in that situation know is absolutely typical. Somebody's off on one side trying out something, then 6 people are doing something somewhere else. Somebody else is behind learning it. People are hanging on. The kind of, if someone's stretching, the kind of randomness that he chooses every time, whether he's doing dancers, whether he's doing the race course, whether he's doing even women in trying on hats. And in the sculpture, it's particularly clear. There's a sense that these things are kind of happening under his hands. The poses are never the culminating moment. One of the reasons I think I disliked these so much as a child is that I knew perfectly, or teenager even, was that as a dancer I knew that that was not what an arabesque was supposed to look like. That was not the ideal arabesque. There's that wonderful, even allowing for the vagaries of 19th century performance, which were in France certainly less rigorous than Balanchine demanded, or the Russian tradition at the time. But even in 19th century France, this was not the ideal achieved arabesque. There's a wonderful perceptive thing that Arlene Croce said, not in her recent article that has created such a controversy, about Balanchine, Balanchine's dancers, always striving towards an essentially unattainable ideal, saying the arabesque is real, the leg isn't. Well, in Degas, both the arabesque and the leg are all too real. So this is not the culminating position, nor is it a tense position of preparation, containing the future movement. It's a moment of passage, a moment of transition, either on the way up or on the way down. And that is absolutely characteristic of these figures. It's part of what gives them their energy and their formal inventiveness. They appear to start from the center and to have limbs coaxed out from the center point. So their balance seems precarious. They seem almost in motion. Part of that's technical. Part of that is his indifference, as I say, to traditional logical transfer of weight, worrying about whether this could stand up by itself or not. But part of it, I think, is a very deliberate choice. Somewhere I'm going to have to say something about dating these and about Degas' eyesight. because there's always a great deal of discussion as to why he started making sculpture and why he devoted so much attention and so much of his time to making sculpture. Degas' eyesight deteriorated steadily through most of his life. It's hard to know exactly how much, because it was a kind of convenient way of avoiding things that he didn't want to do. It could protect him from things. It provided a wonderful excuse. There is no doubt that there was a problem, and that modeling the sculpture, feeling with his fingers the trajectory of the body through space, was a way of learning about a pose, finding an image. For Matisse, we know it was a way of finding new contours. There's a dialogue with Matisse between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional, one constantly informing and shifting the other. It's one of the most fascinating things about Matisse, this whole relationship between the two and the three-dimensional. With Degas, it's not as one-on-one. You rarely find two-dimensional images that correspond exactly to the three-dimensional sculptures. There's the occasional horse that seems to be made as a model to study that, but it's not that cut and dried. These things have very independent lives. It's also clear that he started making sculpture long before his eyesight is supposed to have deteriorated enough to have made a difference, although dating of these sculptures is extraordinarily problematic. And for those of you who care, Tintoret supersedes Millard, who supersedes Rewald. And there's probably somebody who has superseded Tintoret in the last couple of weeks. It's an enormous problem that perplexes scholars because these things, as I say, were never exhibited, there's very little documentation, and it has to be pieced together from references from other things. Plus, he kept reworking them. The issue, however, is not so much why or even when he did them as the fact that he did do them, and that this represents a major part of the history of figurative sculpture that, curiously, was not known at all. And I sometimes wonder what the history of modernist sculpture would have been like had these been shown earlier. They were not cast until the 1920s after his death. And certainly, I mean, I can remember when they were first, when I first became aware of them, when a group of them appeared at the Metropolitan Museum, and that must have been, what? It must have been still in elementary school. So it must have been sometime in the 50s, and I remember it created a furor. People were fascinated. It was news, even then, when they were certainly not secret. It's like what would have happened if Masaccio had lived longer to the history of Western art. The sense of instability, of imminence, is one of the most powerful characteristics of these works. A back view of a remarkable piece called Woman Caught Unawares, and one of these, there are many variations on this, dancer looking at the sole of her foot, where the exploration of the permutations of how you pull a leg out at different angles, looking as though there isn't any one particular point of view. There's the sense of this having been coaxed out from the center. But at the same time, these transitional poses carry with them a memory of an earlier position and the implication that it'll be completed. And that sense of movement is clearly what becomes Degas' main preoccupation. Instead of the fidelity to visually grasped appearances that we saw embodied in the little dancer 14 years old. The obsession remains constant, whether it's bronze or whether it's pastel. There's another component here as well. He was extremely interested in photography. Took photographs himself, some of which have a very clear relation to the pastels and the monotypes and even the sculptures. And he was fascinated by the photography of Edward Muybridge, the stop time motion studies, and used those actually for his horses. Like many people, he was thrilled by this new information that a galloping horse never goes into the position that galloping horses had been shown in art for decades, centuries probably. You know, they never stretch out all four legs. They've got all the feet under them. And that was incorporated into one of his works, as you'll see. But both the sculpture and the pastels share this sense of transition, of the unobserved observer, which has led some critics to write about these as embodying the taste of the experience of the voyeur. A curious notion, since anyone who's working from the model is obviously engaged in complicity with the model. So the fact that we know this is art, that this is sculpture, that this is a pastel, immediately tells us that this is no voyeur's work, that there is a whole set of rules being obeyed here. But there's certainly a sense of intimacy and surprise, which I think has to do with this sense of incomplete pose, of movement, of a change. What fascinates me is how differently the sculpture and the pastels operate. There's always an implicit relation to the boundaries of the two-dimensional work, that vertical and horizontal that are given by the dimensions of the canvas or the pastel always seems to condition what happens within. It happens in the tiniest of the monotypes, and it happens obviously in this late pastel. And so it's disciplining all this kind of wild posing, the audacious cropping, and the very, very intense color. The color isn't reading as it does in the flesh. Those of you who saw the last Degas show know how loaded and how brilliant and how layered those late pastels are. There's always more of a sense of springing from this center in all directions, disregarding a conventional harmonious contour in the sculpture. Something that gives these, particularly these seated figures struggling to emerge from their armchairs, a fresh kind of formal quality that very, very few artists have picked up on, oddly enough. I think of Gaston Lachaise and maybe Bill Tucker. The field is wide open there. Another one of the seated women. And another one of these, slightly earlier but no less remarkable, pastel, where there's this almost flipping of space, where it takes a while for you to sort out just where those articles are, where's the ledge. In its own way, as much a reinvention of the figure as this merging of the figure with the chair. The hand in these sculptures is always extremely obvious. The motion, the touch, the rapidity of Degas' making of these sculptures. Even though we know he worked on them for a very long time, they always look as though they're in a state of just having been worked on. And the good cast, the early editions, it was a series that were made right after he died and the contents of the studio were found. They preserve very, very faithfully the quality of the hand and the bronze. And I don't want to get to this whole vex thing of surmoulage and the waxes versus the bronzes. It's very complicated. Doesn't matter whether it's women or whether it's horses. The racetrack scenes, these are some of the boulevards, there are the place in the theaters, the café concert, performances, and the racetrack. Again, motion, horses instead of dancers. And again, the moment, a late pastel and an early painting, which both have this quality. This isn't the peak moment of the race. This is the milling about. The same moment, the same transitional moment that he chooses in the dancers. And the same moment that he chooses in his sculptures of horses. the rearing horse, the startled horse on the right. Again, one of these unforgettable and remarkable images. The one on the left can be actually compared to an actual, to a Muybridge image. That's a, you know, he was, the realism, the naturalism, is the desire for truth is still there, even though the truth can't be seen by the eye. Muybridge's photographs came as a surprise because you can't see that position with your eye. And Degas was faithful to that in his work. The sculpture on the left, which is a dancer about to dance, is about the most tense, poised of all of the sculptures. Much more typical is another version of the dancer examining the sole of her foot, with a straighter knee and further off. There are differences, trust me. But in both cases, I think, there is still this sense of, let's say, of having begun with the torso and extending the figure in space without any regard for how it's supported. One of the reasons that there is such a sense of tension in the poised figure on your left, I think, is because of that you feel that she's pulling herself up to hold herself up. But the much more typical is the one on the right. Yet another version, see what I mean? Now that's part of what separates Degas, not only from most other figure sculptors, but even from his fellow anti-academic Rodin. Because no matter how articulated the limbs in Rodin, who, like Michelangelo, seems to dispose parts of the body in an almost abstract way, and in fact literally had a supply of various body parts that were assembled. You could have different arms attached to different torsos. This St. John the Baptist, of course, exists as a walking man without the head and without all the arms, and then also is a very remarkable armless sculpture as well. But no matter how radical, and this is about as radical as Rodin gets, especially without the head, there's still much more of a logical sense of support. There's a tilt, but there is a sense of a central mass supported, however precariously, on this bracing triangle. There's a sense of it having been built up, or at least having its weight transferred down. That is quite, and of course there's a huge size difference here, which slides don't care to take into account. We have to shrink the Degas. But the sense of weight, the sense of structure, I think is quite different here. And there's none of the expressionist warping of limb to limb. Look at the way that arm is pulled out in an almost rhetorical way in the Rodin. And the non-rhetorical articulation of the figures, of the limbs in the Degas. It's a different evocation here completely. That sense of the hand, that sense of the artist's touch, is one of the most striking things about these. And I would argue that Degas is very much aware of that. It's not simply expedient. When he chooses, just as he dressed the little dancer, to put a real object into this woman washing her left leg, an inkwell that stands in for a tub, a mass-produced, machined, highly finished object. I think he's doing that not just because he wants a tub, and a real-looking tub, but he's doing it almost the way the Cubists collaged in fragments of actuality, to make the invented world more real, to make that modeled figure and her setting a reality that's different from the actuality of the tub. The hand in the pastels does something similar. The repetitive stroke, the sense of touch, the cropping of the figures that calls attention to the artifice of the artist. Those are all things that he emphasizes that are not entirely peculiar to him, obviously. That kind of revealing of means is part of modernism. It's certainly part of Degas modernism. And there's a paradox inherent there that I want to pick up on in a moment. But there's another aspect of Degas modernism, and that, I suppose, you'd have to call a kind of psychological overtone. No matter how enthralled you are by the audacious structure of the portrait of the woman with flowers on the left, or the bold, clear composition and the lighting effect of the painting on the right, the McElhenney collection, variously, the one on the left, of course, is in that. The one on the right, known as Interior, known as The Rape, depending on who you read. It's clear that there's something unsettling about these pictures that has to do with a kind of implied narrative. The story is told that one of the reasons for the peculiarity of the picture on the left is that first he painted the flowers and then he decided to put in the figure. But that certainly doesn't explain it all. The way that figure is crowded in, the way she is gazing out beyond us, turned not inward but outward in a different direction. It has that same nervousness, that sense of discomfort that we saw in the portrait of the sister and her husband, in the portrait of the self-portrait, double self-portrait, and in many others. The Barili family is a very well-known one. And everything in this painting conspires to accentuate that. He could easily have put in the figure in a way, if he chose to, put in a figure in a way that would not exaggerate the compression, that would not suggest that there's a desire to escape beyond the confines of the canvas. I'm not storytelling here, I'm just trying to point out formal things that create that kind of discomfort. The painting on the right has, of course, been linked to Zola's novel Thérèse Raquin, and another novel which also is about a tragic love, and inspires that kind of questioning about what's going on. It's had all kinds of things attached to it, none of them pleasant or good. I'm also obligated to show that painting because one of the last things Graham Nixon asked me was, are you going to show any of the interiors? So I am showing an interior. I've paid my debt there. Roe, you are my witness. But the narrative here is already an indication that he is not operating in quite the same realm as many of his colleagues. Once again, an indication that he has a relation to older art, a relation to the past. He's a neoclassicist by training, and by his first teacher was the star pupil of Ingres' star pupil. So it's a direct line here. Every time we think he's moved into a new realm, there is something that pulls us back into a connection with the past. But of course we know that modernism was not a rupture with the past in the way that, say, Dadaism or Futurism was, a deliberate rejection of past values. It was an attempt to build on the past a seamless transformation that ended up, almost in spite of itself, being new. Part of what made it new was that revelation of means, that permission to see how it was made that was given to the viewer. Michael Fried has made a very provocative point about starting from the very simple idea that paintings are made to be beheld, that the painter is the first beholder of the painting. Sounds obvious. Now, think about what that means in terms of the way modernism reveals its means. By allowing the viewer to see how something is made, to see the mark of the artist's hand, to see his touch, to see how the bones of something are revealed. The viewer is allowed to participate in a way that is perhaps as close as you can get to the artist's experience of being the first beholder. But what does that mean for sculpture? The sculptor is both the first beholder and the first toucher. But sculpture is not made to be touched by anyone other than the maker. You know what happens if something is exposed in a public place and a hand approaches. Hysteria. It's, partly the practical terms of what the acid of hands do to metal, but there is a convention that the only person who's allowed to touch is the maker. So here's this sculpture that reveals its hand, reveals the mark of the hand, reveals the process, but was not made to be beheld. It was made for the artist himself, to be private. So you can make a case for this being the most physical and the most visual of all sculpture. Whether you want to go that far, of course, is highly speculative. But what I think is clear is that within this rather complex set of influences, a deep and passionate link with the past, an equally deep and passionate willingness to experiment and to invent. Within these two polarities, you end up with someone who makes some of the most remarkable figurative sculpture of any time, and work that arguably has not had its full implications realized. Thank you.